All right, let me invite you to take your Bible this morning. Turn with me to the book of Esther, please. The book of Esther. Esther chapter 1. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this story in the Bible. All right, I see quite a few hands. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. It is. There's some uniqueness about the book of Esther, and I'll try to comment on some of that uniqueness. But one uniqueness is that it is, I believe, the only book of the Bible where God is not mentioned. And that seems strange that there would be a book in God's Word where He's not mentioned. Now, I can't say He's not talked about, but His name does not appear. But as I've often said about this book, though His name does not appear in this book of the Bible, His fingerprints are all over it. There's no doubt in my mind of God's involvement in this book of the Bible because His fingerprints are all over it. And I want to talk a little bit about those fingerprints this morning that God leaves on what He's involved in and what He's working with. As a matter of fact, as we look at the book of Esther this morning, there's two ideas that I want to bring to mind. And both of these ideas have at different times by different people, they have been assigned the responsibility of the events and activities of this story in the book of Esther. Those two ideas are this: coincidence and providence. Now, let me comment just for a second about the difference between the two. I know they sound similar, and they sound like they might even have the same root. But they're actually two entirely different words. Coincidence is a word that comes from Latin, and it's the two words brought together, con, C-O-N, and incendere. And so what we put those two words together, and it means that which fell out, that which fell upon, or something like that. And so the idea behind coincidence, and this is even obvious in the way we use it in our terminology today, in our vernacular, the idea of coincidence is something that just happens. We would say about a coincidence, it's just something that fell that way. There's no particular rhyme or reason to it, but as the events fell out, they just happened to fall this way, or they just happened to correspond and relate to one another in a situation. We often use this word when we're kind of surprised about the way something happens. Oh man, that's an incredible coincidence that this happened to fall in this manner and this happened to fall in this manner. Have you ever walked into Walmart and seen somebody and thought, what a coincidence? Or maybe even said it outright. What a coincidence that I would see you here, or you're going through some aspect of life, and maybe you find something that had been lost for quite some time. What a coincidence that I would be looking at this particular thing, and right now, what you're saying there is, isn't it interesting that it fell out this way? It just kind of happened this way. Then there's another idea called providence. And like I said, it sounds similar to coincidence, but they don't actually share a root. The word providence is from two words as well, pro and videncia. The word pro means ahead of or before. Videncia is the root word where we get our word video, which literally means to see or to visualize. So you have these two words, providentia, before or ahead of, and then videncia, to see or to visualize. And so when we put the two roots together, we come up with a compound word, providence, which means to see ahead of or to see before. So when we read the book of Esther, the way these things happen, we've got to ask ourselves a question. Are these things coincidence, or are they evidence of providence? In other words, did these things just happen to fall out like this, these events? Did they just happen to fall like this? Or were they orchestrated by one who sees something before it ever happens? Is it coincidence or is it providence? That's what I love about the book of Esther. So here's the events. Now we're not gonna have the opportunity to dig in with both feet and exposit all 10 chapters of this book. So we're actually going to move at a pretty good pace through particular events that transpire in this book. And so let's get started. Chapter 1 and verse number 1 is where we're going to start reading here. Chapter 1 and verse 1. This is what he says. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 107 and 20 provinces. That in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. Now, that's quite an explanation there of a huge party that took place. I think anybody who's a thinking individual could read those verses and think, somebody's showing off. I mean, don't you see that in there? I don't know if this is on the part of the insecurity of the king or the pride of the king, but I do know this. You can't read Esther without coming to this conclusion, that the king was a very troubled person and he was a very insecure man. We don't know exactly how old he was, but he was fraught with insecurities and he greatly cared about what people thought about him. And so he decides that being in his position, he's gonna throw a party, and he's gonna have this party for 180 days. That's 180 days. So he throws, I'm not making this up, he throws a feast that lasts 6 months. A 6-month party to show off to servants and princes and the power of Persia and Media and the nobles and princes of the provinces. He just has all the bigwigs in his kingdom come in, and they party for 6 months. Well, what do you do after a party of 6 months is over with? Well, apparently, you party for 1 more week. No, I'm not making it up. That's what it says. So he throws a 6-month party, and then after the 6-month party, he declares another feast for 7 days, And this is open to all of Shushan. All of those that were present in Shushan are able to attend this party and come to this party because he's got a little bit more showing off to do. So let's touch up the decorations. Let's add some more. Let's make it grand. Let's add some splendor, and let's get this done. And this huge party that has been going on for 6 months now culminates in a 7-day party that's open to the entire capital city. So here's what happened in the party. Verse 7, they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So in other words, if you have to ask for it, that's a problem. None did compel, meaning that the law of this feast was that the servants would have the drink ready and all of the pleasures ready. And if you had to ask for it, something was wrong. Just everything was just so very available. It's like turn a kid loose in Chuck E. Cheese, and he needs no tokens. He just goes and plays all the games. Free. I mean, it's just whatever you want. It's in front of you. It's all here. You don't even have to ask. Well, nobody had to ask for pleasures except the king. He sent and requested that his queen come and make an appearance. Now, there's a lot of speculation by a lot of scholars over exactly what the king requested of Vashti, and maybe how there might have been some inappropriate requests that were made here. But for whatever reason, Vashti had made her own feast for the women in the royal house. And on the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, we would read in verse 10, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Bagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So he's not only showing off his gold and his riches and all of the pleasures and everything like that, he's going to show off his wife too, as this trophy wife. Hey, I want everybody to look at my wife. Well, she says, I'm not coming. For whatever reasoning, she said, I'm not going to do that. And it just seems like, based on the insecurities of Ahasuerus, he's inclined to say, okay, I don't want her mad at me. Apparently that was wrong, so okay. But unfortunately, he's made a public issue out of this. And so the princes get involved and said, King, we got a problem here. We got some major empire-wide problem. You have set us up for difficulty, sir. And if you don't deal with this in the right way, we're all going to be in trouble. Okay, what's the trouble? Well, our wives are going to hear that Vashti told you no, and then they're never going to do anything we ask. Because if Vashti the queen doesn't have to do what her husband tells her to do, then our wives are never going to do what we tell them to do, and this is going to be horrible. You've got to do something. You've got to fix this. Off with her head. No, it wasn't off with her head. But it was, hey, you've got to set this right, and the whole kingdom needs to understand that the queen's behavior is not acceptable behavior. Verse 18, this is what they said. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there be a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another. that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. So in Esther chapter 1, Queen Vashti is deposed, and there is a vacancy in the spot of Queen of Persia. Here's the question, and I'm not asking you to answer, I'm asking you to think about it. Coincidence or providence? Chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers into all provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan the palace, to the house of the women under the custody of Hegai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now, I love that word in the Bible, because often when you read the word now, you're turning a corner to say, let me show you what God's doing. And that's exactly what's happening here. Verse number 5. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So in Shushan the palace, there is a Jew who still loves the Lord, who has not forsaken the God of his people, who is raising up a young girl who is beautiful and very fair to look on, and lives in the city where the king lives. Everybody with me? I mean, we would have to ask ourselves that the queen's been deposed, the queen's estate is going to be given to another, and here's a young Jewish girl who lives in that city, who is fair and beautiful and meets all of the requirements of a superficial man. We would just need to ask ourselves, coincidence or providence? Verse 8, so it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. Are you getting this? There's a bunch of women that are gathered up and brought in. But one stands out. One gets the favor of the guard of the women. Coincidence or providence? Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. And so they go on and they talk about the purification and the adornment and things like that. So in Esther chapter 2, Esther becomes queen in Vashti's stead. But that's not all that happens in Esther chapter 2, because remember, Esther is going up to the king's palace before the court of the women. He's going there every day for what purpose? Well, to find out what's going on in the king's house? No. He's checking on Esther. He had a personal responsibility to her well-being, and so he's positioning himself to fulfill that responsibility by making sure that Esther is okay. And in the passing of time, fulfilling his responsibility as a guardian, he happens to be in a place to receive some particular news about something that's going on in the palace. Verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So Mordecai, in the process of his daily business as a man in Shushan and going to the gate and going to the king's house, he overhears keepers of the door that are mad at the king who have a legitimate plot to kill him and overthrow him. And so Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther writes it in a note to the king, but she doesn't sign her name. She signs Mordecai's name because that's where the information is coming from. So at this point, all Esther is a delivery person. The message is from Mordecai. It is signed with Mordecai's name. It goes in the record books and to the attention of the king in Mordecai's name. Do you understand that here's Esther writing out a note to give to the king, and she could sign it Esther, but she doesn't sign it Esther. She signs it Mordecai. You say, that's not a very, very big detail. That is actually going to turn out to be a huge detail. That his name was on that piece of paper. So that's exactly what happened. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So when it gets written in the book of the Chronicles before king, so the historians that are writing everything down about the king and his life and everything like that, his rule, so they write, on such and such a day, word was received in the king's palace that there was a plot to overthrow him. Investigators were sent out. They found it to be absolutely true. The king's life was spared by a man named Mordecai. And it goes in the Chronicles of the king. That's an incredible coincidence. Or wait. Might this all be the events under the control of one who sees before? Some of these, as you're reading this, some of these events don't even necessarily have significance yet if you don't know the story. But as you continue to read and the story continues to develop, then you realize in Esther chapter 3 that there's a man named Haman who really thinks he's somebody in the kingdom. And he wants to be everything in the kingdom. I think Haman's the kind of man that realizes he's dealing with an insecure king, and if he can just be his advisor, if he can just be in his ear, he can manipulate this king, he can control this king. I mean, let's just be honest, with an insecure man like this, you could practically be king and just use this guy as a puppet. And Haman seems to operate in that way, and that's his aspiration. And so he wants the acknowledgement of everybody in the kingdom of how great he is and how special he is. And so there ends up going out an edict that everybody's got to bow down to him, except there's a man in Shushan who's living under an Old Testament law that says you don't bow down to anyone but God. And this man's not God. And so when Haman comes riding along and everybody bows down, Mordecai doesn't. And it's not because Mordecai is a jerk. It's because he's not going to give an honor he's not going to give an honor that only belongs to God to this man. He's not even the king. I think it might be very respectable and honorable for Mordecai to bow down to a king, and probably did so. But this man's not the king. This man is an egocentric maniac. And Mordecai's not going to give him the delight. He's not going to give him the satisfaction. So he doesn't bow down. This angers Haman. It angers him deeply. It angers him even more when he finds out he's a Jew. Now, his Jewishness became the central issue in Haman's mind. There's been speculation as to why that was. The Bible does identify Haman as an Agagite. What's interesting about that is the only Agag in the Bible was a king that King Saul, was commanded by God to kill, and he didn't. If there was an heir to Agag that escaped that situation, and the Bible doesn't say, then Haman might be an heir of that king that Saul was disobedient to God and did not kill. There could be a connection there. We don't know that. We can't be dogmatic about it. It could be that he hated his Jewishness because his Jewishness was the reason why he wouldn't bow down and do like everybody else was doing. But man, Haman hated Jews. That's for sure. So Haman comes up with a means to manipulate the king and get an edict declared that would give Haman revenge over the Jews. And this happens in chapter 3. The Bible says in verse number 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. The king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. So they write it down. It's written in the law of the Medes and Persians. Not even the king can overturn this. And all of a sudden, a post is set out to all over the Persian kingdom, that on such and such a date, the people that were to rise up and kill, destroy every Jew in Persia. Let me pose a question for you to think about. If this is successful and every Jew is destroyed, what does that eliminate? It sure eliminates the promise that God made to send a Messiah to be the Savior of the world. God promised that he would send a Messiah. And as of the days of Esther, I'm talking about as of around 473 BC, there was no Messiah yet. So that means that God could not allow this edict to be carried out. But guess what? Here's the exciting thing. Before the edict was ever sent, God was already putting people, putting things, putting ideas into position, setting it up to bring it down. That can only be done by a God who is providential, a God who sees before. So he sends out the edict. Verse number 15 of chapter 3, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. In chapter 4, Mordecai, having now received the edict himself, informs Esther of the edict. And Esther says, I can't do anything about it. Now, they're talking through correspondence. They don't get to talk directly. But Mordecai is talking through correspondence with Esther. And Esther says, I can't do anything about it. And Mordecai says, listen, you've got to do something about it because this is all Jews. Do you think that you will escape any more than any other Jew in the kingdom? Once it's found out what your heritage is, it's written in the laws of the Medes and Persians. It's not going to change. And so Mordecai goes to Esther and he says, Esther, I need to inform you about this plot. And Esther, I want to ask you to do something about it. Esther, I want you to consider this, that it is very possible that a providential God has placed you in a position as you are. You say, he didn't say that. I know he didn't say that, but it is all around his words. Let me read to you exactly what he did say. He said this let me read just a little bit. Verse 10 of chapter 4. Again, Esther spake unto Hatach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. It's been a month since I've been called in to see the king. I don't have audience with him. And if I go in and I'm not called, there's two options. Either he holds out the golden scepter for me to touch it, or I'm killed. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, verse 13. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, listen to these words. Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. If you want to see God in Esther, there it is in that sentence. Mordecai can only say that if he has faith in a promise that's been given. Mordecai's not sitting back here going, Esther, if you don't do this, all the Jews are going to be destroyed. He doesn't say that. He said, Esther, if you don't do this, God will raise up deliverance from somewhere else. You know why he says that? Because he has the Word of God. He has the promise of God. And he knows that God is at work right here. Watch what he says. He says, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You know what he's saying right there? Esther, this is not coincidence. This did not just fall out this way by happenstance. You are come to this place for this time on purpose, led by a God who has already seen in advance, who saw fit to see Vashti disposed and the queen's chamber opened, and for you to be installed in that position. And if anybody has access, Esther, you do. And who knoweth but whether thou hast come to the kingdom for such a time as this? I'm telling you, faith can be contagious. Sometimes we need a reminder that we can trust, but faith can be contagious, and it was here, I'm happy to say. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer, go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. You say, that doesn't sound like faith, preacher. I mean, she's planning on dying. And I'm going to tell you, sometimes you got to prepare for the worst while you're still living by faith. I got a lot of sympathy for Esther here. She didn't get to see the waters parted and the children of Israel walk across on dry ground. She just got to hear the story. She hadn't been through a lot of circumstances living in a strange land to see God do great and mighty things in her young life. She had just heard the stories. And whereas the stories are wonderful, she has no personal experiences to walk on yet. But she's about to. And so she sends word back to Mordecai and says, all right, I'll do it. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. And then we get to chapter 5. Esther prepares a banquet. And she invites the king to the banquet. And guess who's there? Haman. No, I'm not making it up. But now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court. This is the moment right here that she obtained favor in his sight. Not a coincidence. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. Whoa! Was this man in love or not? I mean, I can say that to my wife and it don't mean much. Half my kingdom's not huge, I'll tell you that much. But this is the king of Persia. He says, hey, baby. That's not in the scripture. But once again, it's all around his words. You just listen to it. He said, what do you want? Make your request. Up to half my kingdom, and it's yours. And Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Keep all these details in your mind. Nobody knows she's a Jew. Haman knows she's queen, and he knows this. The king and the queen are having a banquet together, and they've only invited one person. And it's me. Why wouldn't he come? I mean, he's glad to be there. He said, hey, this is it. This is it. This is my moment. This is my glory. Finally, the acknowledgement I deserve. I've been invited to the banquet. The king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? See, he's still smitten. Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, don't you see how it takes, and when you're in a royal court, it takes forever to say anything. Let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow, as the king said. I don't know if this is a matter of she's just really struggling to get up the courage or get up the nerve or what, but her first request is, I'll make a banquet and you come. He said, okay, we'll do it. They show up. They have a banquet. All right, what is it that you request? She says, my request is that you come to another banquet tomorrow night. Okay. And then you'll make your request, because there could be a part of him by now that's going, man, I got a mighty big blank check sitting out there, and I really want to know what she's going to ask for. I mean, I can't go back on it now, but I would really like to know. So she's stringing them along. It's what women do. Verse number 9, then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him. He was full of indignation against Mordecai. Don't you know how a God-loving person can ruin somebody's day? I mean, somebody that just wants life to be all about themselves cannot stand somebody who just wants to lift up God. They just see that person as somebody that gets in their way of their happiness. I also want you to understand, look how fragile the happiness of the world is. Look how circumstantial the happiness of the godless is. He's walking out here, "Ooh, I'm invited to the banquet. Nobody else is. I can't wait to go home and tell my wife, Zeresh, about what has happened to me today and what's going to happen to me tomorrow. And I'm just going to go through the gate and I'm going to..." I hate that guy. And all of a sudden, he can't even be happy. He can't even be happy about being invited to the banquet and everything. Because this one guy in all of Persia won't bow down to him. And he said, "All right, I'm taking this guy out. I got to go in and out of this gate all the time. And every time I go in and out of this gate, I have to be reminded that there's one idiot who won't bow down to me. So I'm going to take him out." His day's coming. His day's coming. But he's going to get special treatment. He's going to get special treatment. So in that moment, Haman refrained himself, and he came home and sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, "Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, "Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai might be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made 50 cubits high. I'll help you out there. About 75-foot high gallows. I'm pretty sure this is a statement piece. He wants everybody to know. So here's how it plays. For time, I'm going to tell you the story. So he goes to bed that night with the gallows being built. And I don't know this. It's just the way my imagination works. I imagine it. I wonder if all the hammering on the gallows that night kept the king awake. But for whatever reason, the king couldn't sleep that night. I don't know if any of you have ever done this when you can't sleep. You just get something mindless going and hope you fall asleep to something mindless, you know. For a while, we were selling my preaching tapes that would help people go to sleep better if they were struggling. But we don't have that capability anymore, so that's not an option. But for whatever reason, he couldn't sleep that night, so he calls for one of the servants. He says, "Hey, bring one of the chronicles of the histories of my kingdom and read to me." That should do it. Read a history book. That'll do it. And he can't sleep, and this servant's over here reading. And he says, "And on such and such a day, it was made known to the king that there was a plot to take his life. An investigation was made and was found to be true. The king's life was spared, and the perpetrators were hanged. And this was done by Mordecai." And the king says to the servant, "What was ever done to Mordecai? How was he ever rewarded?" Does it say? No, there's nothing in here about that. "King, I don't think you ever rewarded him. About that time, he hears something in an outer chamber. Who's out there? It's Haman, Lord. It's Haman, King. Oh, Haman, come on in, man. I need an advisor right now. I'm glad you're here. Oh, yeah, of course you're glad I'm here, because everybody's glad that I'm here, you know. I got a question, Haman. What should be done? What do you think should be done to a man that the king delights to honor? And Haman immediately thinks, who in the kingdom could the king possibly delight to honor more than me? Now, keep in mind, the whole reason Haman is there at that moment is to ask the king if Mordecai can be hanged on his gallows. That's what he showed up that night, or that early in the wee hours that morning to ask. And now he's caught in, and before he can ask his question, the king has a question for him. What do you think should be done to the man in whom the king delights to honor? Well, I can't think of anybody that the king would like to honor more than me, so let's make it good. I think he should wear the king's clothes. I think he should ride the king's horse. And I think that a high-ranking official in the king's court should walk along beside and lead the horse through the city and cry out, "Thus happens to the man in whom the king delights to honor." Now remember, he's thinking at this point, he's in the king's robes. He's on the king's horse. And the king says, that's a wonderful idea. You, Haman's thinking, yes, go do everything that you just said unto Mordecai. What? Now look, at this point in the story, are we really going to say, well, that's a coincidence? I'm way beyond coincidence at this point. There's no coincidence at this point. No, this is being orchestrated by someone who sees ahead and counters every move. So the next scene is, in the story, Mordecai's wearing the king's robes on the king's horse, walking through Shushan, the city, and Haman, of all people, is walking beside him. Thus happens to the man in whom the king delighteth to honor. I'm sure there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm to it. And he's so angry at this. But he's got this. Hey, I'm still the only guy that gets to go to supper tonight with the king and queen. So he goes in there, and Esther lays it out. She says right before both of them, she says, King, there's a plot against my people to destroy us all. You see, King, I'm a Jew. And somebody in your kingdom has made an edict to have all Jews destroyed, and that includes me, King. And it's written in the laws of the Medes and Persians, and it cannot be undone. And the king is distraught, and he doesn't know what to do. And he leaves the room, and when he leaves the room, Haman is petrified. He thinks surely his life is over. So what he decides to do is he's going to cozy up to the queen. So he climbs up on the bed with the queen. And the king comes back in and finds Haman in a place he has no business being. And at that point, the king doesn't care who he is. as Jerry Clower would say it, the king has done flung a craven on this woman, and she is his. And nobody's going to step in the middle of that. And he commands Haman to be taken out and hung. If they only had a gallows. Oh, wait, here's one. 75 feet in the air. Hang him on it. Then the king turns around and he talks with Mordecai, and they make an edict, another edict. He can't undo the first one, but he says this: Mordecai, here's my ring, here's the finances, here's whatever you need. Mordecai, you write another edict that says when that day comes that everybody can rise up and kill the Jews, you make another edict that says Jews can defend themselves. And that anybody that tries and fails, the Jews get all their stuff. It made a whole lot of people second guess trying to wipe out the Jews. You know what? God saved the Jews. He spared the Jews. They still celebrate the Feast of Purim because they exist. Because if it hadn't been for God, they would have been wiped out. But in a book that never bears his name, his providence is on page after page after page after page. The workings of a God who sees before and is always at work. Providence goes along with something called sovereignty. And his sovereignty works in accordance with his providence. And by the way, God's providence worked for the Jews in the book of Esther, and God's providence is still working today. The same God who changes not still sees ahead, and he is still at work. Can I tell you, we're going into a new year here, and I don't know what all this year has, and I don't know what all challenges there are, and I don't know what all I'm going to face as an individual or we're going to face as a church, but I take great comfort in the fact that there is a God who is providential. He sees ahead, he knows, and he's already working. We want to build a building this year. I believe the Lord's going to have us build a building this year. There's all kinds of things I cannot possibly foresee or know. But there is a God who sees ahead and is already at work. There are going to be problems. There's going to be difficulties. You in your individual life are going to face trials. You are going to face difficulties. There are going to be problems. But know this. We can always know that the providential God, the one who sees before, already knows, and he's already at work. There's times that I get on my knees to pray about something and find out that the answer is already there. God started on that weeks ago. That's a providential God. Westside Baptist Church, Beatrice, Nebraska. March the 1st, 1950. It's a Wednesday night. They have choir practice every Wednesday night. Choir director was militant about being on time to choir practice. Choir had 15 members, but you be there on time. Choir director's daughter was the piano player. She later gave testimony that she could not remember one time any choir member had ever been late to choir practice. Choir practice started promptly on Wednesday night at 7:30. The choir director demanded that the choir participants be there at 7:25. After that would be late. So when I announce choir practice here in a minute, y'all listen up, all right? But on March the 1st, 1950, at Westside Baptist Church in Beatrice, Nebraska, not one choir member arrived on time. And all 15 had quite different reasons for why they didn't show up. Not even the choir director was there on time. Because her daughter, who played the piano, was laid down to take a 15-minute nap before choir practice, and it ended up being 30. Her mom couldn't get her woke up in time, and so they were late. There was another man named Herbert who sang bass in the choir, and he was writing a letter and lost track of time and was late to choir practice. There was 3 teenage high school girls. One of them was working on a geometry problem that she couldn't figure out and decided to stay with the geometry problem and not lose all of the mental process she had been through in the equation so far, and wanted to finish that problem before heading out. She was the ride of 2 other girls who were waiting on her. There were 2 different people whose cars wouldn't start. There was one lady who lived across the street from the church. She had been to church that morning, gone home, eaten lunch. She was dressed and ready to go for choir practice, but what she wasn't expecting is in between she wasn't at church that morning. She had been by the church that morning, gotten home, and what she hadn't expected is from the time that she had gotten home to choir practice time, the temperature had plummeted. The pastor had come by at 4:30 and lit the coal-burning furnace downstairs to heat the church. And the lady that lived across the street was dressed and ready, but when she opened the door to go and saw nobody else at the church, she closed the door back and went back and sat down. At 7:27, she opened the door to go to church for choir practice. And the building blew up and disintegrated into tiny slivers of wood, almost unrecognizable. Apparently, an underground gas leak had leaked through the foundation into the church, built up, and when it hit the coal-burning stove, it blew the building into smithereens. And the furnace was located immediately under the choir loft. They said that had anybody been in the building, there's no way they would have survived. But on March 1st, 1950, 15 choir members, the pastor, his wife, and little girl, who were always there for choir practice, even though they didn't sing in the choir, none of those 18 people that were always there and there on time were there at 7:27 when the building blew up. You can look at that and go, that's amazing coincidence. Or you can say, God takes care of his own. God watches out for his people. That doesn't mean we will never face tragedy. It doesn't mean we will never have problems. But I'm telling you, God sees ahead and he knows and he watches out for his. And we can take hope in that. We can rest in that. We can trust in that. Maybe you're struggling with that. Maybe you're saying, look, God's never done a good thing for me. God's never watched out for me. God's never helped me. All my life has ever been is problems and difficulties and tragedy. Wait, you might not see the whole picture yet. Maybe the whole story hasn't developed. You can't get a full grasp of the joy of the book of Esther by reading the first couple chapters. But by the time you get to the end, you can turn around and look back and say, I never would have thought it, but it sure is obvious now. The hand of God was there all the way. And I don't know what all you've been through, and I don't know what all you've struggled with, but I'm telling you, if you'll trust him, if you'll believe in him, if you'll follow him, if you'll obey him, there will come a day where you'll be able to turn around and say, his hand was there all the time. He was working. It wasn't always easy, but he was there, and he was at work. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes.